All right, so thank you so much. It's pretty fantastic to be back connected, at least virtually, with Stanford. When I was a grad student there, I went to the PCD seminars a lot, so it's lovely to be giving one myself. And so today I've decided to talk about design spaces for visualization and how to develop them. And this is going to be a fairly methods-oriented talk because I figured that a Stanford HCI seminar audience would be interested in the sort of methodological underpinnings, particularly those that go beyond just visualization and are more broadly applicable to HCI, although I'm certainly going to be focused on visualization in what I say here. So this term, design spaces, well, this has been a continuing theme in the visualization literature. There was an early paper from McKinley and Card in 1997 called The Structure of the Information Visualization Design Space. That might have actually been the first time I personally had run across that term used in this context. And then it continued. There was a nice paper in 2009, for example, from Javan Elmquist, exploring the design space of composite visualizations if you have, say, multiple views. A nice one on a design space for visualization tasks. I'll also be talking some myself about design spaces for visualization tasks. This was by Schultz et al. In 2013. Really lovely paper just a few years ago from Madison Elliott and other folks from the vision science research community on a design space of vision science methods for visualization research. So there's just quite a bit of these papers that propose design spaces. So what exactly are they? Amusingly enough, if you read a lot of these papers, they don't necessarily even define the term. They just use this term, and they often mean something in a rough neighborhood all around a central point, although there's sort of differing definitions. My current one that I came up with for this talk, gleaning from a few of the existing ones, is imposing a systematic structure on some set of possibilities for a particular design problem. And the idea is you're trying to really capture the variables that are central to the design problem. And the reason is you're trying to support some kind of reasoning about the set of choices that you could pick in this design problem. Now, what are people typically proposing? They're somehow delineating. They're giving a structure of that space. And a key part is that you have these independent, cross-cutting, orthogonal ways to divide things up. Sometimes people call these axes or dimensions or categories, but the key idea is you've got places in which you can make independent choices that have been, and so you could, enumerate the set of possibilities in a way that helps you think. Now, people call these many things. I picked the word design spaces for this talk, but people often call these taxonomies. Sometimes they call them typologies, and they quibble about the difference between those two. They might call them classifications, more general terms like frameworks, even a super general term like model. So, in my own work, I've called these everything from design spaces to taxonomies to typologies to frameworks, actually to classifications. I've called them all these things. So as I talk through some different papers we've done in the past, I might actually switch between using these words that I'm basically all using. So I particularly like, there was one from Javan and Elmquist, which is a longer one, a space within which to express design patterns. It's another sort of useful way to think about that. Now, what are they for? So back in the Card and McKinley paper, their argument was that the reason they wanted to describe and analyze portions of the design space was to understand the differences between designs and to suggest new. So there was this idea of somehow think about how are things different from each other? How can you use this in a creative way? Now, in the Elliott paper, I like their definition: design spaces provide an actionable structure for systematically reasoning about solutions. So somehow there's this idea that it helps you do something. And then there's an interesting paper from Pal Ralph that was actually published in the Transactions on Software Engineering, which has a lot of very applicable advice for the HCI and visualization communities that talks about methods for both taxonomies and process theories, where he argues that taxonomies increase cognitive efficiency and they support inferences. And the way that they do that is they help you to group together similar instances to let you reason about that entire class rather than point by point reason about the instances of things in that design space. And I find that a very useful framing. So how do you know if a design space is helpful or good or better for a particular purpose than a previously published one or useful in any way whatsoever? How do you assess a design space? That's a methodological question. I'm particularly fond of a framework that Michel Baudouin-Lafont talked about, and he had in mind assessing interfaces rather than design spaces or taxonomies, but I've actually used it quite a bit for taxonomies, and I find it instructive to think about, first of all, descriptive power. Does it give you the precision to distinguish what you care about within a set of existing examples? So can you use it to describe existing work in a way that helps you think? Does it, put things in the same category that really should be there? And does it let you distinguish between when you need to for the purpose of reasoning and exposition? Then there's evaluative power. So the ability to help you from a set of alternatives you're thinking about, can it help you decide which one might be better for a particular purpose? And then there's generative power. Does it help you create something new? So can you can you describe existing, can you evaluate possible, and can you generate new? Those are three interesting ways to think about the utility and suitability of a design space. So how do we create them? Well, a really common way, and actually a theme that runs through all of the ones I'm going to talk about myself today, is this idea that it would happen through an open coding process of source material. And in case that's not clear, when I say coding, I don't mean programming. I mean this qualitative analysis method where you're coming up with a set of tags to describe instances, and then you can use those to actually create this categorization. It's typically a very iterative process, a lot of refinement. Sometimes it's called just thematic analysis. A particular framework for doing that's called grounded theory. But I'm sort of going to think about all these, although they have some, relatively subtle methodological differences, these are all ways that I'm just going to talk about as open coding some kind of source material. And we'll talk about different kinds of source material and what that leads to. And of course, you could go off and read research papers. So in a literature review, then you're typically going to say, well, there's a bunch of theories out there. Maybe I'm going to synthesize a new one. And you often want to compare a new design space to previous ones or contextualize how yours fits into the previous work in that area. And then there's a method of personal reflection, which is you just sit down and think. And of course, any kind of an iterative open coding process does have a certain amount of you sitting down and thinking. But having a design space that includes thinking broadly means you don't just have to be constrained by the source material you're open coding. It really is something where you can think quite a bit about, for the purposes that you're trying to create your design space, what would be a useful way to structure things, again, to help you think. So I'm often going to call that reflective synthesis to really highlight the idea that you're often bringing many, many things together. In some deep sense, it's everything you've ever read or thought about, and that you're using as part of this creation process. So broader than just open coding a specific corpus of source material. Now, what's interesting, of course, is you're not forced to do just one, and many real design space creation processes have these sort of interesting and complex combinations of those, as I'll get into. So I'm going to actually talk through 4 major examples of creating a design space. One is really focused on a data type of temporal data, where the instances in the design space are visual encodings of timelines. So, how do you actually make a visual representation of a timeline? One is more domain focused in the domain of genomic epidemiology, where what we're thinking about is a design space for how would you actually make, figures in research papers that are helpful for researchers in this field. I'll often abbreviate that as Gen Epi. There's one in the domain of journalism, which is not focused on visual encoding, but focused on activities and tasks. What are people doing when they're wrangling or cleaning data? And then finally, there's a very domain agnostic one about a design space for abstract tasks. So I'll be talking through the similarities and differences in developing these design spaces. So let's jump in. Let's now start talking about timelines. So this is a paper. First author was Matt Bramer, who at the time was a PhD student at UBC. He's now at Microsoft, Tableau Research. But this was done in part while he was at Microsoft Research with Bangchen Li and Natalie Henri Riche, and Benjamin Bach was also at MSR at the time. So this paper is called Timelines Revisited, a design space and considerations for expressive storytelling. And what we were thinking about was, what are some ways of creating timelines specifically for presentation? So there's often a split between exploratory and expository, or exploration and presentation in visualization. And so we were specifically thinking of the context of presentation. So narrative intent, something that's interesting there. And we ended up proposing a design space with 3 axes. There was this representation one about, how are things actually looking? Are they linear? Do they wrap around radially? Is it a 2-dimensional matrix like a grid or a spiral, or just any sort of positional layout at all? And then ideas of scale. If there's some idea of, do you know that you've got a timeline that's purely chronological? Are you just interested in relative differences between? Do you log scale it? Is it just simply an order? Do you have some idea of durations in between, not just points in time? And then finally, for the layout, is it just one thing? Have you faceted into, you think of this as multiple views or multiple timelines? Do they wrap around, or do you have a combination of those? So if you think about this, right, there's 5 and 5 and 4. So sort of theoretically, there could be up to 100 possibilities if we just enumerate them all. And we went through and thought, for these various combinations, what we wanted to do was think about, how are people actually using this? What's the narrative point? And when you're looking at that, what is the perceptual task that you're doing for that particular visual encoding, right? So here's one where we've got a radial layout and it's sequential and it's a single unified one. And we could go on and say, well, what about some other points in this design space? What are you trying to achieve? Like compare sequence lengths between these facets. Or here's one where instead of a circle, we're looking at a spiral. And it's a slightly different perceptual task, and you can think about information density. Here's one where we've got a grid. So we went through and we did this characterization of both the narrative point and the perceptual task that was at play in these visual encodings. And an interesting outcome is they're not all good. And in particular, we propose, of the 100 possibilities, we characterize 20 of them as what we called viable combinations. And by viable, we meant we had criteria of, purposeful. You could actually use it for a particular narrative purpose. Interpretable, in the sense that the person viewing it could decode what you were trying to encode. And then also generalizable. It's not tied to a very specific thing, but it's a general way that you can encode this kind of temporal data. So we proposed that these 20 were really the viable ones out of the 100 possibilities that the design space could afford. So a key question, how did we do this? So the process we used to create this model was a sort of 2-phase creation and then analyzing. So in order to create that design space, what we did is we actually assembled a fairly extensive corpus of source materials, which was actual, visually encoded timelines. And we did this from, say, infographics, visualization technique papers, tools that allowed people to create timelines. So a really broad set of timelines. And what we wanted to do was get something that was as broad coverage as possible of the ways that people would visually encode this temporal data. And then we did an open coding process where we would look at all these, we would try to create groups, think about what a good exemplar was, and then think by actually sketching alternatives with pen and paper, what are some other ways that this data could have been represented that would make sense? And of course, a lot of iteration. And the result was that 3-axis design space that I've shown you. And then there was this second phase where, given that design space, we then went in and analyzed and thought, of the combinatorics, which ones do we think are reasonable? Because a very interesting hint was, in that entire corpus, only 24 of those combinations even appeared. And we actually made a judgment call about which ones we thought were a appropriate and suitable use of visualization. And there was 20 of those that we actually thought were wise choices for encoding. So let's go back to that lens for assessing and think about, okay, how did we argue that this design space was useful? So for descriptive power, what we did is we actually stole an idea out of machine learning of gathering a second test set. So we thought of the corpus we used to create the design space as the training set, although we didn't actually use machine learning, but we took this idea and we gathered a new set of timelines we had not looked at when we created the design space. And then we checked whether all of them were actually covered in useful ways in our design space axes. And in fact, they were all describable. The whole set of originals and the whole set of additional test set ones, all of them could be described in this design space. And of that, sort of aligning with our take about what was viable, we thought that 253 of those were matching that set that we thought were wise choices out of the 100 theoretical combinatorial possibilities. Now, in terms of generative power, how did we actually show that? Well, we took those 20 viable designs and we instantiated a authoring software, what we call sandbox software, just to let people play with things. And so we implemented that, and particularly having animated transitions between each of them, so that if you were trying to do something like create a storytelling video, you could. And so we then tried to find a representative set of data sets that covered a lot of the possibilities and actually used the toolbox to create a bunch of these timeline designs. And we actually, with the paper, had 7 full videos going through a timeline and telling stories with it using this authoring software that was built around this design space. And so that was how we tried to show its generative power, is that we could actually build something to let people use it. And there's a nice adoption story. This was both open sourced, and it's still up and running if you want to play with it at timelinestoryteller.com. And that's a free browser version. And it was also integrated into the Microsoft product Power BI as an add-on. So that was a nice way of getting stuff from research directly into people's hands. Okay. So that was a little story about timelines, and that's a data type. Now let me tell you a story about a domain, about genomic epidemiology, GenEpi for short, because that's a lot of syllables. And this was work done in collaboration with Anna Crisan, who at the time was a PhD student at UBC. She's now at Tableau Research. And Jen Gardy, who's at the time was a UBC professor. She's now at the Gates Foundation working on malaria. And at the time, both of them actually were part-time affiliated with the BC Center for Disease Control. So they had a deep domain knowledge in epidemiology in particular. And so this GEVIT project was actually both proposing a method and presenting a typology created with that method. So let's take a look at that. So what we proposed was a particular method for creating typologies that was really a mixed methods approach, where we were mixing qualitative and quantitative approaches in a very deliberate way. And so it was a sort of multi-phase process that was built around the idea that you'd have some big corpus of research papers, and you could do an automatic literature analysis phase. And then, based on the results of that, you could do visualization analysis that mixed a qualitative first phase followed by a quantitative phase. So let me talk you through that. This particular typology we developed, which we called GEVIT for Genomic Epidemiology Visualization Typology. In the first phase, the analysis phase, we would actually go in and create clusters. So we would use NLP techniques to create topic clusters, and then we would use those for stratified sampling to make sure that we actually had coverage across all of these clusters. And so we used a random stratified sampling approach for actually being able to sample articles and then extract figures from those sampled articles and then go in and do open coding on what are they doing in those figures. And I'll talk you through what the actual 3 axes were of GEVIT in just a sec. So what we called this was not just a design space, but a domain prevalence design space. So, the big picture is that the literature analysis could be used to address this question of why are they researching it? What are, the clusters, the topics that these papers are about? And then the visualization analysis could first say, how are they visualizing? And then for each of these, how many examples are there? So in particular, we had this idea that you could say, well, in infectious disease genomic epidemiology research articles, we could use text mining to find both the topics that just came out of pure text mining and also any concepts that domain experts thought would be interesting to make sure to be able to sample for. And then we could do that random stratified sampling, take the output of that, try to describe what the elements are, and then quantify. And that because we're actually trying to be very careful and systematic about coverage, doing that kind of a count would be a reasonable thing to do, even though often in a purely qualitative analysis process, we wouldn't normally try to argue that counts are meaningful. In this one, because of the care taken to do that stratified sampling, we do think that, in fact, it's a reasonable thing to do. So just to sort of click by the numbers, I'm not going to walk through all these numbers, but I want to point out, why do we have to be systematic? It's because when you start out and you do a literature search on PubMed, you get 18,000 articles, and you're not going to, open code all of those. So after we did the clustering and removed articles that didn't fit into clusters, and then we removed the articles without the human pathogens, and then removed sort of, very small topics, we ended up with a total of 18 of these topic clusters that turned out to map very clearly into particular pathogens that cause diseases, and then other a priori concepts like surveillance or all kinds of things like that that the domain experts decided were useful. So they had these two sort of cross-cutting ways to have clusters to sample. And what they ended up doing at the end of that sampling process, that I'm not going to go into in exact detail here, with a couple hundred papers. And those are something where you can extract all the figures. So that was 800 figures, which is a lot, but nowhere near the, tens of thousands that we would have had. So what was the design space actually going to look like? We ended up saying that one interesting thing was, what chart types are they using? So common charts and relational charts like node link graphs, temporal charts, spatial charts, a lot of trees, phylogenetic and otherwise, a lot of very specific charts used in genomics, and a collection of others. And so one of the axes of this design space was, well, what chart type are they using? But then another axis was, and how are they combining it? Are they doing any sort of spatial alignment, either horizontally or vertically? Or are they showing relationships between these multiple charts with something like matching color coding or matching shape coding? Are they using the visualization technique of small multiples to have the same visual encoding across a bunch of disjoint data sets? Or did they just slam two figures side by side as subfigures, maybe just because they had space constraints in their article? And even though they're next to each other, they don't actually have any explicit alignment at all. It's just sort of more of a grab bag. And since we were doing this idea of stratified sampling, then we were able to actually come up with counts of noting numbers that we thought would be representative of what people were doing. And finally, the third axis is the idea that they didn't just take something that they might have automatically generated. They often added things onto that, sometimes with tools, but often manually. And what's interesting from a visualization person's point of view is it's very common to talk about point and line area as types of marks that can convey information, which you can then visually encode with channels like size and shape and color. But they did this with text too. They did a remarkable amount of using fonts and colors and even font face to try to express categorizations. So that was a very somewhat surprising from a sort of visualization dogma point of view of just how much they were trying to use the text properties itself to encode additional information. So just to make this a bit more concrete, here's an example of a figure from a published article. And from the literature analysis, we knew that it was a particular pathogen, in this case, Enterococcus. And then from the chart point of view, we can say, well, there was a tree and there was a heat map, and one of these sort of one-dimensional heat maps we call category stripe in between, and they were spatially aligned where it meant something, that they had shared horizontal position. And then there were a bunch of these other marks. They actually added branches between two different trees to show where those species were the same. They actually used color coding to try to show these groupings within the tree. They added some of these annotation marks. So let's think about what the assessment of this one was. From a descriptive power point of view, it really did provide a common language, which really hadn't been there before. It wasn't clear what kinds of visualizations people were using in this domain. And we were able to notice that, because we saw what they actually did, not just what the tool supported, that there was a huge amount of stuff they were doing that was not supported by any current tools once we saw the breadth of what people were doing. In terms of evaluative power, we could see there were some shortfalls, from a visualization point of view, perhaps overusing, text as a way to convey information perceptually. And in terms of generative power, in some follow-up work, we did do the idea of trying to actually build it, to try to take that design space and instantiate it, in this case, as a recommender system. So using this idea of domain prevalence and design space and counts to build something that would automatically recommend a visual encoding for particular combination of data sets. If people are curious, that's hot off the presses, just got accepted into TVCG, and we'll present that at Viz in the fall. And there's a link to that. All right, that was the second one. What about a third one? How did we think about design spaces in data wrangling? So this is joint work with Steve Kasica, who's currently still a PhD student at UBC, and Charles Barrett, who at the moment is a postdoc with me here at UBC. So this is an actionable framework for multi-table data wrangling from an artifact study of computational journalism. So what do I mean by that? All right, this idea of data wrangling, sometimes this is called data cleaning or data cleansing or any of these things of you take the data set and you have to do something before you can actually do the kind of analysis you had in mind. Now, journalists do a lot of data wrangling. It's a general idea in data science, but journalists in particular, especially with the advent of a lot of visual data journalism, are doing a lot of data wrangling. And what's interesting about it is they show their work. A lot of that wrangling in many contexts is done behind the scenes in all kinds of domains, but the journalists actually tell you what they did. They literally call it the nerd box. That's the internal name for when you have that little sidebar snippet that says, well, here's the methods we use, and here's the link to how we did the analysis. And so they actually publish their code. They will publish data wrangling code in repositories, whether GitHub or Observable, or there's many, many hundreds of these out there, because there's a journalistic value of transparency, editorial transparency, so that the public can actually see how you came to the conclusions you did, or your colleague could reproduce that. So there's this culture of transparency, which makes it a really interesting target for wrangling research because we can see what people are actually doing. So what we did in this is what we're calling a technical observation study, following some terminology from that Paul Ralph paper I mentioned at the very beginning, where the artifact that we're coding is journalist software scripts. So to really understand what are journalists doing, journalists who code, how are they data wrangling, we had a process for trying to make sure we had good coverage of all of these repos, and then we did open coding of the software scripts that did the wrangling. We also ended up creating sketches of how the data flowed between the different tables because it ended up being so unexpectedly complex. So these were not things we found in the repos, these were our interpretation of what the code in the repos were actually doing. And the result of that process was very detailed taxonomy of how data wrangling is done in computational journalism. And then we had a second phase where we wanted to say, given these very bottom-up taxonomies, how does this align with previous work in the area? And let's make sure that our tags for our codes in our open code set are actually harmonized with this previous work. And where are there differences? Where do the journalists do something which hasn't been talked about by generic data wrangling papers? So then we adapted that taxonomy and iterated and refined it even more until that was finalized, and then said, but those taxonomies, they have great descriptive power, but they don't seem to have much generative power. Can we come up with something that would be more helpful in letting us build a tool to address some of the pain points? And so there was this reflective synthesis process where we re-characterized in a design space that was much more suited for having generative power. So I'm not going to go into great detail on here. I'll just mention that we looked at a total of well over 1,000 repos and using a set of inclusion criteria, and then narrowed that down to a set of a couple hundred that were suitable. And then we sampled from that multiple times, keeping some diversity criteria into account, trying to make sure we had a range of journalists, large newsrooms, small newsrooms. And so we ended up open coding 50 of those in great detail to generate the first level taxonomies. and then went and did this alignment process and had a taxonomy with a total of 165 codes, and then created this much more concise framework and checked it against the first set of taxonomies. So what are these? I'm not going to walk you through every single detail of them, but at the high level, there's actions taken by journalists, and there's processes that was our interpretation of what we thought they were doing. And we really wanted to distinguish between those because one was interpretive and one was much more descriptive. And this had a lot of power. This was quite detailed. It went down 5 levels to some very detailed descriptions, a total of 165 codes in that code set across both. So that was great for description, but it wasn't really something that we could use to build tools around. And so that's when we started thinking, well, what is interesting here? What are the points of divergence? And the sheer number of tables that journalists were using was jaw-dropping. These are all some of these diagrams trying to show what was happening with data flow between tables. There's a lot of arrows here. And so we found, there were some quite relatively simple ones, but also some very, very complex ones. And it wasn't well supported by any kind of interactive wrangling tools like, something like Trifacto or Tableau Prep or that kind of thing. These weren't scaling to the sheer number of tables and the ways that people were chopping them up and shoving them together. So we thought, well, how could we think about a framework that would let you build a tool to support this kind of stuff much more cleanly than anything we saw before? So we proposed a design space with 2 axes. One is focused on the kind of thing they're doing. Is it a table or a row or a column? And one was focused on essentially what kinds of operations are they doing in terms of the number of things in and the number of things out. So creation is where you go from nothing to something. Deletion is where you go from one thing to no things. And then any kind of a one-to-one transformation or any kind of a separation from one thing into many or combining many back down into one. And that actually gave us a really concise and quite actionable design space that we thought had suitable generative power for thinking about this. And so that was an example where we really needed to go from one design space to another where we thought differently about descriptive versus generative power, so that we had something we thought we could build a tool around. Then we did want to make sure that this new space actually covered all the cases of the actions taxonomy, and in fact, it did. Spoiler alert. So let me just go back to this one moment. We haven't actually built this tool yet. We do hope to. In fact, I'm actively looking for any sort of journalist partners who'd be interested in working with us. We've already talked to the folks behind Open Refine, and we really are interested in building kind of a multi-table wrangling framework. And so I'm actively looking for collaboration partners as we go from this investigation to actually doing tool building quite soon. Okay, so now for our last one, let's think a little bit about abstract tasks. So this multi-level typology of abstract visualization tasks was joint work with Matt Bramer when he was still a PhD student. People have thought a lot about tasks in visualization and the need to somehow, in a domain-independent way, say, what are people doing? And sometimes they call them tasks or goals or intentions or objectives or activities or interactions. They use a lot of different words that are all sort of in the same general ballpark. A lot of these are quite low level, right? Like retrieve a value or, find maximum value. Very, very low level operations. And some of them are incredibly high level, like integrate insight. And what we argued was there was really a gap between these that needed addressing about how to go from, between low and high. So a multi-level taxonomy to help you along. And there have been some work in that area, but not nearly as much. So what we did was a process where we went very deep into the literature and also very deep into reading and thinking. So we did a combination of open coding of the literature where we read dozens and dozens of papers, grabbed all of the words they used to describe any of these tasks, and then tried to come up with something that was integrated across all of them, but suitable for a visualization context. So a lot of reading and thinking, rearranging, trying to group, trying to simplify, and iterating, where what we were open coding was what had been proposed both in actual taxonomies and any other research papers that address these questions of abstract tasks. We did a lot of this. There was a lot of iteration. You can see some physical whiteboards, all kinds of digital whiteboards where we went through and came up with many, many possibilities as we finally ended up with a quite concise taxonomy of 27 terms that we thought suitably covered a big hunk of the visualization task design space. In that final one, we had 3 axes, and the 2 really well-developed ones were why and how. And there was also a sort of stub what space of just thinking that there'd be data as input and data as output as possibilities in a sequence of tasks, but we were really quite focused on the why and the how. Now, what we also did in this somewhat heroic table is this is a lookup table where we mapped for every of our 27 terms, we said exactly where in the previous work that term or what we considered synonyms were used. So this was actually across 30 previous taxonomies plus 20 more papers that went deep into these questions of abstract tasks. So for example, navigate, a bunch of the previous work just used the word navigate, but some used words like pan or detail on demand or drill down or any of a number of other words that we considered to be in this category. And so this was direct references to all those papers. Or compare, right? Some previous taxonomies actually used the word compare. Others would use words like discriminate or associate, for example. So this was really to try to give a very clear connection to this rich vein of previous work and let people understand how what we were proposing connected in detail to all of that previous work. Now, we didn't just do this sort of bottom-up approach of looking at what other taxonomies had proposed. We also looked at a lot of theoretical lenses, which was more of a top-down thing. So one of the things we were thinking of, for example, was Don Norman's stages of action, Heidi Lamb's extension of that to add ideas of the Gulf of Goal formation, the literature on distributed cognition and sense-making from Park and other places, play theory, some of my own previous work on what I call the nested model of visualization that really distinguished between thinking about things at a domain-specific level, abstracting that in terms of both the data and the task, and then visual encoding and interaction techniques, and then finally the level of algorithm design. And this was deliberately made to fit into those middle 2 levels, that focusing on the why of tasks and the what of data and connecting that into the how of visual encoding and interaction techniques. So thinking about that in terms of these, again, 3 ways to assess, we found that we had something with a lot of descriptive power. It was possible to analyze a lot of existing interfaces in terms of sequences of these tasks, which really helped us think about both the eventual ends and also the means to that end when you decomposed what was going on in visualization systems. It also was really targeted at having generative power of when you were in the early stages of problem-driven work. That kind of work is often called design studies in the visualization literature, where when you're in the process of trying to abstract from domain-specific stuff to a layer that's agnostic to what domain it came from, when you're doing that requirements gathering, that's really where we wanted people to be able to focus. And then for evaluative power, we did explicitly see this as something that would let you have a code set if you were doing field studies, or maybe a task set if you're proposing what people would do in a lab study, and to be able to connect that with this really voluminous previous work. So to possibly get better external validity for any kind of a formal experiment. What's really gratifying is the community has responded with adopting this framework. So there's been hundreds of people who have used this for all 3 of descriptive and generative and evaluative purposes. So that's been really heartening to see. I myself continued on with this. That book Manish mentioned was actually really very much built on top of this idea, and I fleshed out even more this question of how. And in some sense, the entire book is like one huge design space with, how are we able to have visual encoding and interaction techniques or idioms, and why are we doing it in terms of task abstraction? And I also went much deeper into the what as well. So this kind of thinking about design spaces for visualization as a whole is something I've been quite engaged in part because I tried to think about how to describe it in a unified way in this book. I'll mention for those who love abstraction, there was an interesting follow-on paper from just a few years ago where we thought not just about these mid-level tasks, but trying to tie those to higher level analysis goals, where again, we constructed a design space and the source material was that we extracted descriptions of analysis from these problem-driven design study papers because there had been quite a corpus of those published in the years before that. But I'm not going to get into that today because we have limited time. So I've talked about a number of different design spaces, and let me think about similarities and differences. So we've had these four, timelines, GenEpi, wrangling, tasks. Now, in all of them, there was some amount of open coding of source material, either actual visual encodings of timelines, or figures from research papers, or software from repositories, or tasks that were extracted from research papers. Now, there was also different strategies for sampling. In some, we had to assemble the corpus, and that was part of the intellectual contribution, and then we went through and used the entire corpus. In some, we had this huge space, for example, research papers in genomic epidemiology where there's tens of thousands, and then we had a very systematic approach of stratified random sampling of these clusters so that we could actually then do some quantification because we were being systematic. In others, we had something much more qualitative. Like in the wrangling study, we did have this idea of having different criteria for diversity of which of those repos we would open code to try to make sure we got reasonable coverage and hit theoretical saturation. And then with the abstract tasks, we weren't trying to sample, we were trying to see everything. We were trying to grab it all and put it all together in one unified way. So pretty different sampling strategies. There was reflective synthesis in 3 out of the 4, but it happened at different phases. In some, it was an early phase thing where even from the beginning, we were doing a combination of open coding and thinking about what we thought would be something useful. Whereas with the wrangling one, we did that late, where we assembled an entire taxonomy with a true bottom-up process and then thought about could we come up with something different that would actually give us generative power. So it was a late stage reflective synthesis. In terms of, connecting with previous research literature, we basically just mined that for some source material for the Timelines project. We didn't explicitly do a Viz research search, although we were certainly informed by that as part of the GenEpi project. And then we very explicitly tried to make sure we connected to that research what I'll call a light mapping pass with the wrangling project and a really deep and thorough mapping pass to that previous work in the task project. So thinking about descriptive power, we tried validation against a test set for the timeline project. We had this really systematic method that gave us a lot of very comprehensive coverage for the GenEpi project. We had this really high precision descriptive power that allowed us to find where the other work that wasn't specific to journalists diverged from what that group did. And then we had this quite widespread adoption of the task taxonomy, showing that there was quite a bit of descriptive power in that one. Now for generative power, for 2 of these, we built. One we built in the paper itself, one we built in implementation in a follow-up paper, the third we plan to build. So this idea that you could use a design space as the basis for some sort of software implementation. And then there was quite a bit of usage of the abstract task typology when people were doing these sort of design-focused visualization projects after that was published. Now, what I think is interesting is thinking about the descriptive versus the generative power. So in the timelines, we had something where we used analysis to characterize a subset to give us more generative power. And with GenEpi, we used exactly the same ones. We didn't have this distinction, and it was a very detailed, fine-grained one. Whereas with the wrangling paper, we didn't take a subset. We actually developed something completely new to get generative power. And then with the abstract tasks, again, it was the same, but it was a very concise one. So we had generative power in mind from the beginning as we thought about those. So these different approaches, and we really focused much more on evaluative power really only in that last one. And that brings me to discussing the assessment. What I find is I always think about generative and descriptive power. And I find sometimes it's less easy to think about when could you distinguish the power to evaluate alternatives from the power to generate new or describe existing. And I find often in my own thinking that's less obviously a third category than the descriptive versus generative. So I want to come back as a wrap up to this thinking about, well, how do we assess taxonomies, and to sort of frame this in the larger context of different kinds of theories. So for example, Ben Schneiderman in his Designing the UI book talks about descriptive theories, explanatory theories. You can imagine taxonomies possibly fitting into that. But definitely this idea of a prescriptive theory or a predictive theory, that's not what a taxonomy or a design space is trying to do. And I really like the way that Paul Ralph talked about it in this really intriguing paper that I'm going to encourage folks in HCI and Viz to really dive into. It's quite recent. And he talks about different kinds of theories as theories for understanding, where you organize something into useful categories. That's exactly a taxonomy. Versus process theories, where you think about how something happens. Ralph argues these are often sort of augmented taxonomies, so it's useful to think about them together. And he's really separating them from theories of variance, explanations of why something happens, where you've got some sort of causality relationship. These are the kinds of things you can use for prediction, and that's not what taxonomies and design spaces are typically all about. And so since we're not doing that kind of predictive thing, this has implications for how do we assess taxonomies. These are different criteria than the Baudin-Lafont 3 ones. And he goes through and discusses essentially which criteria he thinks are relevant for taxonomies, like parsimony, transferability outside the corpus you made it from, ideas of theoretical saturation to really make sure you've extracted everything you can. Sometimes questions like, is it useful? Is it original? Does it resonate? Or is it perhaps not necessarily resonating by being something surprising and new? Can you test it? These are all interesting, but are not necessarily required. And then specifically argues that questions like statistical generalizability and things like construct or internal or conclusion of validity, those are the kinds of questions you ask of predictive theories like variance theories, but not for the kind of stuff we're doing with design spaces and taxonomies. And so I find this a useful way to guide thinking. And I wonder if as a field, we could really make these distinctions and think about these criteria in addition to descriptive and generative and evaluative power. So with that, I'd like to wrap things up. If people are interested, these talk slides are already posted publicly. The book I mentioned is something you could certainly have a look at because it's essentially one big giant design space for all of visualization. And then lots of stuff on both my research group page and my personal page of courses, papers, videos, software, and many other talks. So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Tamara. That was great. And one of the downsides of virtual talks is that you can't hear all the clapping. So we have plenty of time for questions, and so we'll open up the floor for those. If you're an attendee, please post your question to the chat, and will help us get those to Tamara. So while those are coming in, I had a question, which is,
okay.
That was a really great, it's really great to see those 3 different examples of how to build this kind of taxonomy in design space. And one of the things that I was wondering is, have you thought about tools that could help you build these kinds of taxonomies for different design spaces?
At least somewhat. So for example, that Gevitt project, where we had this idea of you need tools that lets you go inhale a giant corpus of literature and help you find these topics so you could do the sampling. Anna actually ended up just instantiating that as an R package called Adjutant. And we have a separate paper that's just introducing that, and people have ended up using that for this kind of taxonomy creation where you want to sample a really large literature. So we have at least got one tool for that. I think there's so much more that you could do. And I think particularly, I know there's a lot of software for sort of doing generic open coding, but in a lot of the ways that we did our open coding, I don't know that it would have helped. I think that if your source material is like audio files where you want to create transcripts and then code them, or video files. I think there's some software support for that. But where you're thinking about, the space of timelines, Matt Bramer did a whole lot with pencil and paper, and pen and paper. So I feel like the more exotic your source material, the more we don't have good tools. And one of the things I emphasized in this talk was just how broad your set of source material could be. It's not just you stick a video camera down and you film somebody.
Right. We have a question coming in. Do you want to read the question?
Yeah. This is a question. How would you explore the 3 dimensions, descriptive, generative, evaluative powers, starting from a specific data type?
So let me actually go back here a moment. All right. In the example where we said for a specific data type, like with temporal data, with the timeline project, we said, we're not interested in, tabular data, necessarily just, generic tables or node link graphs. We were very specifically interested in data that had this temporal component. And so then when we went through and thought about the descriptive and generative power, it was, do you want to describe things using that particular kind of data type? So if, for example, we had been looking at network data where we had node link relationships, then a bunch of the questions, like instead of just having, things like, is it radial versus, grid, rectilinear grid versus linear, we might have had questions like, with network data, are we showing it as actual nodes connected by link marks between them, or are we showing it as something like an adjacency matrix? That's a completely different visual technique for showing that. So the kinds of things that we would do would be dependent on how people would typically say visually encode that kind of a data type. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question.
We'll wait for Hugh.
I guess we don't have multi-way operations. Also, somebody asked to put in the chat. Let me actually copy that link and put that in the chat. And I think I can send that to everyone. There's that.
So maybe I'll ask another question as we're as we're here. So, the 3 domains you picked were really, really interesting, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you choose the domains to focus on. Do you have a process there? How does that work for you?
You mean like how we pick to do these different projects, like Gen Epi versus journalism?
Yeah,
or do
versus
you just mean
timelines.
Like the whole project at all?
Yeah, no, just how you pick.
Versus timelines versus tasks?
Yeah.
I mean, the short answer is I tend to be pretty opportunistic, and, Anna came and was someone who was an expert in genomic epidemiology and wanted to do a PhD in, going deeper into visualization for Gen Epi. So that's how we picked the domain, because that was her domain of expertise and interest. With timelines, that was something when Matt Bramer was at Microsoft Research on an internship during his PhD. It was a bit of a continuation of some work we had done with a project called Timeline Curator, which was an authoring system for timelines. We'd sort of already started thinking about temporal data, and then he just went to town and went deeper into that. With the data wrangling for journalists, Steve Kasica came to me as someone who had a background in journalism and decided visualization was great and backfilled himself into a computer science background just so we could visualize stuff in a journalistic context. So he came to me with that domain in mind already. And then it took a bunch of looking around until we decided to focus on wrangling in particular as a nice open area. So, I feel like my answer is, depending on who comes to me in terms of collaborators or the possibility of people with data sets and so on, I tend to just say, let's see if there's anything here that could make a cool research project. So that's not a very principled answer, but that's the reality.
Well,
it's fun.
Are there areas that you think would be ripe for, you or others to look at?
I guess I tend to think that mean, I personally, and maybe this is me just sort of rationalizing what I like doing, but I think there's great value in going back and forth between specific and general. You know, it's not a coincidence that I had 3 more specific things and then the super general one. And I feel like you basically, like, there's sort of different lenses, right? And one lens is a data type lens, and one lens is an application domain lens, and one lens is a sort of technique-y lens, like, you know, what are you trying to do and what are techniques for doing that? And all of those have value. And so, you know, I think for any one of those, I could then answer the question, like, say, you know, well, what's understudied? You know, you and I were just talking about text as something where, you know, in my sort of worldview, there's 3 major data types, which is tables and networks and spatial data. And what you do with text is you sort of do a lot of transformations, but in order to turn it into one of those. And so, you know, with domains, I mean, there's a lot of domains that have a lot of data, sometimes even a lot of funding, and have a history of making poor human beings do things that as a computer scientist, you're like, oh my God, that's what computers are for. Stop making your grad students do that kind of stuff. And so I feel like biology and genomics is just one where I'm like, oh, computer science could make your life better. Even while understanding that what they're doing in that domain is big and complicated, and you can't just hit the button and say analyze. You're going to need humans in that loop for a very long time coming. So I think domains with intrinsic complexity, where you're not just going to automate your way out of their analysis problems anytime soon, are really great domains to be thinking about. And so it's kind of a long-winded answer to say, at some level, all of it, but there's definitely particular sort of understudied data types or techniques or domains that are just rich problem sources. You know, I like journalism because, you know, at the end of the day, it matters in the world. They often, you know, it spans the spectrum from, you know, talking to humans to analyzing big, you know, leaked data dumps or Freedom of Information Act requests where you might have a lot of document analysis to do, but you're really trying to go back and forth. So I like that as a particular data science domain, but there's many others. I don't think there's a domain I wouldn't like if I found, you know, the right collaborator. There's just such a richness of domains.
Yeah, it's one of the nice things about visualization generally.
Yeah.
Tamara, unfortunately we are out of time, so thank you so much for the talk, and thank you for visiting us here at Stanford.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that I couldn't make it there in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you by Zoom, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.